Hello, and welcome back to another video exploration of the story. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I'm presenting these videos as a companion going along with the Bible study that we are doing in my congregation based on something called the story. Kind of looks like that. The story is a condensed Bible narrative put together a few years back by a guy named Randy Frazee. And it really kind of looks at an overarching big picture of what God is up to within our reality, based on the narrative portions of the scriptures, and it kind of condenses it down chapter by chapter into more of a almost novel type form. Is the way that it's presented. Very applicable and useful in terms of seeing the narrative of what's gone on within our history of the church. So that is kind of the point of what we're doing, and studying it chapter by chapter within the congregation or within the Bible study itself. And then I present these videos just to kind of go along with it as a recap of the discussion for those who were unable to be with us for the week's discussion. This particular week, we are in chapter 30, which is entitled Paul's Final Days. We are moving right towards the end of the story. We only actually have one more chapter left, which we'll hit next week. But within this particular chapter, we were looking at the tail end of the Apostle Paul's life. The previous two chapters have been focused pretty heavily on Paul. The last one, if you happen to catch that video, which was a couple of weeks ago due to Easter and vacation on my part, we looked at Paul's time of ministry, kind of his missionary journeys following his conversion, and the different travels that he did, the different encounters that he had as he established churches, both within Jewish and Gentile communities and groups around different portions of the Roman Empire. So that's kind of what we looked at last time, as well as we looked at some of his earlier letters, his earlier writings that he wrote to some of those different communities. This week, this time around, we see a very strong shift, and Paul is really looking towards the end of his life. As the chapter opens, we see that he is kind of giving some final greetings to some of the different areas, the different communities that he's helped to establish, and with the knowledge that he likely will never see these people again, and so that's kind of where things start. And he's heading towards Jerusalem, though we don't know exactly why. Just essentially that's where he needs to go, and he feels led that is his direction where he needs to go. Now, when he gets to Jerusalem, Paul experiences pretty hefty opposition on the part of the Jewish leaders, that in many ways mirrors the opposition that Jesus, had experienced, a few decades before. And we talked some about the parallels that exist between Paul's story and Jesus' story. And now when we do that, and we hint at those, we never want to make the mistake of saying, well, Paul was like Jesus, because, of course he wasn't. But their stories do have similarities, particularly in the form of the opposition that occurred with the religious leaders that opposed their message, and really the message of both of them, and the way that they tried to overcome those individuals, Jesus and now Paul. And similar in scope, that they view it as they are breaking the religious law, but they have to appeal to the political system in order to try and have them punished and silenced. And so that's take them to the Romans and trump up some charges against them. That happened to both Jesus and Paul. Some differences that come about really come to surface when we see how that goes. When this is all going on and Paul is taken into custody, he's actually saved from the mob by a group of Roman soldiers who are basically kind of like, hey, what's going on here? Why are you in such an uproar? But Paul's status as a Roman citizen grants him certain privileges that an ordinary Jewish person would not have. We don't know exactly what his role or where he falls in the hierarchy of Roman citizenship other than he is a citizen and he was born that way. It comes through his father's lineage that makes him a Roman citizen. And because of that, he is offered a bit of protection, protection from some of the punishments that could have befallen a non-citizen person. He's kind of saved from the mob in that aspect as well. And even though there's a plot against him and against his wife, a plot to try and have him killed because, hey, you want to silence somebody, killing him tends to work. That's kind of foiled because of the insight of his nephew, who comes to the commander and says, hey, there's a plot against Paul, so don't send him there. And eventually Paul appeals to the Roman emperor, and as a citizen he can do that. And so he is sent to Rome, and we hear within this chapter about his travels to Rome, which would not have been pleasant as a prisoner. It probably wouldn't have been great, and they went by boat, and there was a lot of hardships that they faced, including shipwreck and including being marooned on various islands in the Mediterranean Sea, and including Paul reaching in to grab firewood, and a snake bites him on the hand, and he kind of just looks at it and shakes it off and doesn't die. But there's a lot of hardships that he faces on his way to Rome. And when he finally gets to Rome, he's kept under house arrest and for 2 years, and he's in this home, and people can come and go, but he can't. He has to stay there. But we hear in the closing portion of the book of Acts, or the closing statement, that's what he's doing during those 2 years. Everyone who came to him, he proclaimed the gospel to, and so that's kind of how things are going there. We see that he goes to Rome, and the chapter tells us also that after that 2 years he's released, and it's thought that he goes on one more final missionary journey on farther to the west, out possibly as far as Spain, but we don't exactly know. And then eventually he's taken back into custody again, where he's ultimately killed. That's kind of the end of the narrative, and from there we flipped into a couple of the letters of Paul that are featured, and they're considered to be a portion of his letters that are called the prison letters, the letters he wrote during this time of imprisonment. We have Ephesians, and then we have 2 Timothy, which are the two that are featured. Now, both of these also happen to fall under the category of the disputed letters in terms of, did Paul actually write them? And a lot of present-day scholars think, probably not. They were probably written by someone else and attributed to Paul, which was a pretty common thing at that time. But as we waded into discussion about those, we talked about the familiarity of them. You know, it's the way the lectionary falls. Though we don't often hear from the book of Acts within the lectionary, we do hear various readings from the New Testament letters fairly regularly. And so a lot of the aspects that were featured within the chapter were familiar to those of us who were in that conversation. But we see definitely a change in tone, particularly in 2 Timothy. And it's thought that 2 Timothy was written as Paul has recognized that his end is near, and he's basically starting to say goodbye. And but we discussed some of the overarching tone of Paul's later letters, and one of the insights that really came up is how much Paul cares about the people in the communities and the congregations that he has helped to form. There's love there. There's a sense of deep connection and caring and longing to see them and longing for their well-being, and so that sense is definitely there, and it's certainly present within almost all of Paul's writings, that he has deep connections with these communities and with these people and with the individuals within those communities. So we talked some about that. Now, interestingly enough, in our conversation last night, we went on several tangents, as oftentimes we kind of do. But one of the main tangents that we got onto, just in the general flow of conversation, was our traditions and where traditions have come from and how they've developed, and how change is difficult, and change is is hard and change is uncomfortable, and because of that, we really find ourselves tied into our traditions as they stand. And though that wasn't the intention of our conversation, that's kind of where it went. And interestingly enough, that echoes the sense of opposition that I was talking about earlier, that Paul experienced and that Jesus had experienced, and the other disciples did as well. That the powers that be, those who know the proper way to do it, those who cling to the tradition, were threatened by this new way, as they called it, the way of God, or the way, I am the way, and that's where it comes from. And that's what they were trying so desperately to hold on to, and fighting tooth and nail against these individuals who threatened that. And we see that, I think, in the world today. And I'm going to kind of wrap up with this, but this is something, again, that our conversation went to. Didn't necessarily have so much to do with what we were discussing from the chapter, but this just, again, conversation, that the change within the church happens, and it's inevitable, and the church continues to become something new. Every day, as Paul says, we are a new creation, and the church is a new creation, and the church is the body of Christ, and we are shaped by the worldwide culture that we live in. And we see, looking back through history, that about every 500 or so odd years, the church goes through a pretty major upheaval. Some pretty big time things happen that are significant within the church's history. And we're right in the midst of that now. The last one was 500 years ago, or 499 years ago, with the Reformation, and the work that went on there with Luther and Calvin and the various reformers. But we're in the midst of the church becoming something new again, and we're definitely seeing evidence of that here in North America. The church in Africa is growing by leaps and bounds, and it's all influencing one another. And yes, our traditions are important, and yet as we continue to mix up our cultures, our various cultures within the greater church, recognizing that we are all one body, and we influence one another and learn from one another, we see these different things that are happening, and influences that are kind of coming from different directions. And it's exciting, but it's also daunting at the same time. And so we discussed that for quite a while last night, and had some wonderful discussion about it. So that's kind of what's happening in this chapter of speaking about Paul's final days. We do hear that eventually he was beheaded and Paul was martyred in the long run, but his importance within the church cannot be overlooked. Without Paul and his mission into Gentile communities, it's hard to say what the church would have looked like now. And granted, this all happened 2,000 years ago, and or almost 2,000 years ago, and yet his work was so vital to spread the gospel around the Roman Empire, and into the far reaches of the empire, and around the known world. And it's, as we can see, it's continued throughout the centuries. And so Paul, a very important character, a very important figure within the history of the early church, and we see coming to a close the end of his portion of the story. If you have thoughts or questions or comments, by all means, please share those, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week.